Welcome back. Now, in this segment, we're going to take a closer look at how society got stratified by about 500 BC at the start of what we call this post-Vedic age. It was right around this time that we first start to see in North India the kind of concretization of a Brahmanical ideological scheme that we now get the name caste in English. First of all, though, I want to stress that what we're going to be seeing is an ideology. It's not a fact. Caste wasn't necessarily how things actually were in ancient India, but how the Brahmins basically wanted it to be. Brahmin communities by this time had acquired a great deal of social privilege already in the Vedic world, and they were relatively financially well off. Right? The theory of caste, what it did was it allowed Brahmins to claim themselves to be automatically at the top of the social ladder and to secure their position there so that their children, their children's children, and so on, right, would never have to worry about falling down the ladder. Right? Now, this wasn't necessarily universally accepted fact, but an ideology, a claim, a kind of wishful thinking on the part of these Brahmin communities. Now, what is caste, you say? Well, maybe the easiest way to think about it is to think of it as two different systems that are kind of made to collide together. One is called varna, the other is called jati. Varna is a classification scheme, and the word in Sanskrit varna means type. And the varna scheme consists of 4 hierarchically ranked types of social groups. Anyway, there are 4 varnas in this classification scheme, but originally, in the early Vedic period, there seem to have been only 3 varnas. The bottom rung of the scheme, the Shudras, was added only at the very end, around 1000 BC, and in fact, we saw where it got added in that Purusha hymn. Right? This is actually a pattern we're going to see throughout Brahmanical ideology, what I like to call the 3+1 formula. You'll see what I mean in a second. At the top of the Varna scheme, as it's classically formulated, are the Brahmins, who are supposed to be intellectuals, priests, ministers, teachers, doctors, etc., etc. Next below them, are the Kshatriyas, whose character made them suitable to be kings, warriors, nobility, aristocracy, etc. Then come the Vaishyas, who are farmers, merchants, artisans, and other similar occupational groups. And at the bottom of the ladder, you find the Shudras, whose only role prescribed in the scheme was to work in service to the other 3 varnas. Again, this labeling was an ideological way that Brahmin communities were able to imagine the social spheres working around them. Right? In practice, we find historical evidence actually where kings, wealthy merchants, sometimes even powerful Shudra leaders managed to seize political, economic, or other kinds of power and improve their condition in life. But the Varna scheme is how Brahmins imagined the social world to look like, a 4-tiered ladder with themselves at the top. Also, we should say that there was another unincorporated 5th class, the outcast, or the Dalit, which is the term used today. This included indigenous or non-Vedic groups, people whose occupations were thought to be ritually polluting, like sweepers, leather workers, or washermen. Sadly, throughout the history of India, from back then in 500 BC up until today, right, Dalit communities have been routinely subjected to the most oppressive conditions, the greatest amount of prejudice, discrimination, disenfranchisement. It's a really difficult problem to solve. Now, alongside Varna ideology, for thousands of years, there's been another system of social practice in India called jati. This is practice, not ideology. In Sanskrit, jati literally means birth. And here it means your family, or kind of extended family, or kinship group. Each and every village across India has many different localized jatis. Each village would have like 20 to 25 jatis that live there. All the families belonging to the same jati usually practice similar occupations. They eat together often, and sometimes, and mostly they're endogamous. This would mean that when it's time for you to get married, your family is going to look for a suitable groom or bride for you from another family of the same jati as you, usually in a village that's not too far away. After marriage, the young man would be expected to continue the family business, whether it's farming, trading, engineering, doing rituals, whatever. It's the way it is in India today, traditional India today, and it was like that in 500 BC as well. So to repeat, jati encompasses the kind of on-the-ground, actualized local practices about marriage, occupation, and so on that are differently configured from village to village. Varna is a single pan-Indian ideology that Brahmins had come up with. The phenomenon that then we can call caste happens when jatis get classified into varnas. Like, for example, saying that this jati of farmers belongs to the Vaishya varna. That jati of farm workers belongs to the Shudra varna. This act of classification always involves a power claim of some sort, which, as you can imagine, has led to violent conflicts between different communities, sometimes even leading to really terrible caste atrocities like massacres, arsons, gang rapes, and so on. At least these days, this kind of thing happens. Maybe back then things were a bit different. Who knows? But I doubt it. Anyway, here's some more tidbits about varna. The top 3 varnas were given a special label. They were called twice born in English, dvija in Sanskrit. These groups were the only ones who could get initiated and have access to a Vedic education. Boys among these varnas would have an initiation ceremony called the Upanayana, where they got a sacred thread to wear and were taught a series of Vedic rituals that they had to do every day for the rest of their lives. Also, the Varna ideology suggests that the reason that this high-low hierarchy was there was because of a phenomenon called pollution. Each Varna was considered to be less pure than the one above it. And when you get to the groups that are even below the Shudras, the Dalits, then all bets are off. Things got so bad in terms of these ideologies of pollution that by around 500 AD or so, we start to see a new discourse of untouchability that emerges, so that lower castes and Dalit groups especially faced severe public persecution and shaming if they were to make any physical contact with high caste individuals or even to drink from their wells. Today, untouchability is officially outlawed in India, though other forms of systematic oppression, of course, still exist. But anyway, that's caste in a kind of nutshell. Lots of things to unpack there. Now, again, most of what I've said only applies to men. Women's lives were much less kind of classified within the Brahmanical texts. For the most part, women are supposed to belong to the caste of their father or then their husband. Now, hand in hand with the Varna categories, we find another fourfold Brahmin scheme of social classification, which is called the ashramas, or the life stages. Again, this is a way to order the lifetime of an upper caste, twice-born male. Women would have had 3 life phases, all defined by either the presence or absence of their husband. They were either unmarried, they were married, or they were widows. For men, there are 4 life stages. These also follow the 3+1 formula. Originally there were 3, and the last one is added later. First, you're a student, or a brahmachari in Sanskrit. You have to remain celibate and unmarried, study with a guru, and acquire knowledge to get the appropriate education that you need based on your varna, on your caste or class. At the end of the student stage, you get married and you transition into being a householder or a gruhastha. Here, the newly married man starts a family, acquires wealth, does rituals, he works, and he enjoys pleasure. When your children are married and all become householders themselves, now it's time to retire, right? And go to a spiritual hermitage in the forest with your wife. You focus on rituals and religious life. You stop earning wealth. You stop possessing property and engaging in other worldly pursuits. But you can still keep connections to your family. Your children and grandchildren can still come and visit you and so on. At the 4th stage of life, you become what's called a sannyasi. This is when you renounce all attachments to all worldly life, including your wife and your family. You abandon all possessions and you search for liberation from the cycle of suffering, death, and rebirth. Like I mentioned before, this is fourth stage, is not part of the original scheme, and it's a later addition. It was 3 plus 1. Another interesting thing was that in the beginning, this wasn't a linear progression in a lifetime. It wasn't like you go through all four. Instead, these were 4 different options that a man could choose once he graduated from Vedic school. So once you get your diploma, once you finish your studies, you could either A, stay as an unmarried student, B, get married and raise a family, C, go live in a forest hermitage as a religious teacher, or D, abandon the worldly life altogether to seek spiritual liberation. Now, what's all this spiritual liberation business about, you say? Well, as we end our segment, along with varna and ashrama, the types and life stages, I wanted to show you one more Brahmanical ideological scheme called the 4 aims of life, or purusharthas. These were the 4 basic life goals that men were to have in a normal society. And again, it's for upper caste men, not for women, shudras, or outcasts who the texts don't really care about. And again, it follows the 3 plus 1 formula. The original 3 aims of life were dharma, artha, and kama. Then moksha, this 4th, was tacked on later. The first 3 aims apply to the householder, who is expected to follow them all at the same time. The last one was for the renunciant, the person in that final stage of life. Above all, a normative householder was to follow dharma. Dharma means being lawful, doing your duty, being a good moral person. The idea was that each person had a special code or moral script that's written just for you. It's your swadharma. This swadharma is a product of different variables that contour who you are and what you're supposed to do in your life, your caste, your varna, your life stage, your ashrama, the historical moment you live in, the kala, the time and place you live in. For example, if you happen to be during a famine, right, there's a famine going on around you, then it's okay to behave differently than you would normally would. You could steal food to survive. It's okay in a famine. Householder was also expected to pursue artha, or power. This is power of all kinds: financial gain, winning contests, defeating your opponents, getting famous, right? Political power, economic power, social power, what have you. Householders were expected to also pursue kama, which means pleasure of all kinds. Most famously, of course, this is sex, since it's the best kind of pleasure, and led to the composition of the Kama Sutra, for example, which I'm sure all of you know about. There's also Kama also included other forms of sensual pleasures: good food, art, music, dance, theater, literature, poetry, playing in the park, right? Actually, there were 64 different kinds of pleasure that the pundits theorized. Now, the last pursuit was the one that was tacked on in the 3 plus 1 formula, and it's called moksha, or liberation. Here, what you're trying to do is to extract your soul from that inevitable process of death and rebirth, which is known as samsara in Sanskrit. All 4 of these aims became the subject of specific theoretical sciences, which were called the shastras in Sanskrit. And one key concern for these shastras was when 2 aims might kind of come into conflict. The conflicts of the different aims of life, in fact, is going to be the central issue in the Mahabharata, which we'll look at later. Okay, so now that we've got this better picture maybe of what normative mainstream society would have looked like at the start of this post-Vedic age around 500 BC, or at least maybe how the Brahmins wished it would look like around this time, let's turn to the Upanishads themselves and see what kind of messages they were sending out to people who were living in this hierarchically organized society. Now we'll do that in our next segment, so stay tuned.